In 1938, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department would start a program to develop a new light rifle for the armed forces. Though the project began in 1938, the requirements wouldn't be officially laid out until 1940. The requirements were relatively simple. The rifle must be chambered in the new .30 carbine delivered by Winchester and must weigh around 5 pounds. Two major companies would take part in the program, Winchester and Auto Ordnance Corporation. The weapons we're focusing on today come from Auto Ordnance Corporation, who submitted two proposals, the Thompson light rifle and the rather poorly named .30 short rifle M1 self-loading cartridge. The Thompson light rifle was heavily based on the M1921 and M1927 Thompson submachine guns, but was chambered in the new round and used a revised barrel. The other was another straightforward alteration of a pre-existing design, with the only major changes being a slightly redesigned receiver as well as a new barrel and bolt face. Thanks to this approach, most of the other internal and external components were interchangeable with the standard 45 ACP Thompson. Amazingly, both designs actually worked very well during the trials. However, both of them would end up being rejected. Can you guess why they were rejected? For one, there was cost. The Thompson is not exactly a very cheap weapon to produce. But the big thing was the overall weight of both weapons, which exceeded the weight requirement by a factor of 2, with both guns weighing around 12 pounds unloaded. With this, Winchester's design would be the ultimate winner and would be standardized as the now famous M1 carbine. Today, the Thompson light rifle seems to unfortunately be extinct, as there are no known surviving examples of it, while one of only a handful of the rather unoriginal name-carrying designs still exists and is currently on display at the Koji Firearms Museum. Now, the M2 Hyde has been described as the missing link between the M1 Thompson and the M3 grease gun, which duh, it's literally M2. Anyway, the Hyde Inland M2 was created specifically as a lower-cost alternative to the expensive M1 Thompson, as in early 1942 it became quickly apparent that the US military needed cheaper guns and they needed them now. During initial testing by the US Army Ordnance Department in April 1942, it was found that the Hyde Inland 1, as it was then designated, performed better than the Thompson in practically every regard, which despite being nearly 2 pounds lighter, still demonstrated extremely controllable recoil during automatic fire, and even demonstrated a 50% higher hit rate over the Thompson at a range of 50 yards. In fact, the testing of the initial prototype had gone so well that only minor revisions were recommended, with the main change being the ability to use standard Thompson stick magazines, and following this change, the Hyde Inland was officially recommended for adoption as the US submachine gun caliber 45 M2. Now, despite the weapon's main selling point being that it was a cheaper and easier to produce alternative to the Thompson, this initial claim was realized to be only partially true, as in spite of its simple blowback action system, the process to manufacture it was anything but simple, as the bolt's diameter varied along its length, meaning only highly skilled workers could be involved in its production, as well as the fact that it required new complex machinery, as well as new production methods to produce it. The contract for production, which was to be carried out by Marlin, was for 164,000 M2s, which would cost between an estimated $36.76 or $38.58 per unit. Considering the M1 Thompson cost $44 per unit, this was not exactly the piggy bank savior the Army had been hoping for. To make matters even worse, the initial production date of December 1942 could not be achieved, and instead, deliveries only began to occur in May 1943, due to numerous problems encountered with subcontractors, as well as Marlin's engineers having to learn the new powdered metal processes which were intended to increase the rate of production. This eventually got so frustrating that Marlin would create a revised version that used standard machine steel, which not only delayed production further, but also increased the production time and the cost. Funnily enough, it seems the Ordnance Department may have considered the M2's potential problems in advance, and had assigned Renee Studler, George Hyde, and Frederick Sampson to collaboratively develop a new submachine gun. This new gun was ludicrously cheaper and simpler, and was tested and ready for production by June of 1943, and would be standardized as the M3 submachine gun. It's certainly a good thing that someone managed to achieve this bit of foresight, as when the weapons began to be delivered for their rather infrequent testing, it was found that new defects had cropped up during production, with one of the major problems being weak recoil springs. Despite Marlin receiving a contract for 164,000 M2s, they would only produce around 400 of them before the plug was pulled on the contract on June 9, 1943. Today, only 6 of these bizarre weapons are believed to exist, with seemingly none of them being on public display, because of course, and most residing in private collections. Now, I want to say outright that this weapon is often incorrectly referred to as the Thompson light rifle. The reality of it is that this weapon had very little to do with Auto Ordnance Corporation themselves, and was simply another creation of George Hyde, which was ironically intended to replace the Winchester M1 carbine. In another rather strange twist of irony, the Hyde submachine gun caliber 30 carbine, or more commonly known as the Hyde M1944, used a lot of internal mechanisms from the Thompson. However, unlike its ill-fated precursors, the M1944 was designed to be as simple and cheap to produce as possible, and used a bolt system that was actually similar to the Soliterne MP34, in the sense that the spring was contained in the buttstock. The strangest feature of this weapon, however, was its barrel, which featured a quick-change mechanism directly copied from the MG42. This feature is incredibly bizarre, though, as the weapon's fire rate was believed to be around the 600 rounds per minute range, so it seems highly unlikely that such a barrel would be required, and even if the weapon could fire at the rate of 1200 rounds per minute like some sources claim, this barrel arrangement still doesn't really make any sense, as the largest magazine available would have been only 30 rounds, which would be exhausted in almost an instant. Now, according to a handful of sources in testing, the Hyde M1944 actually demonstrated itself to be more accurate and reliable than the current M1 carbine. Unfortunately, in typical channel tradition, this is about all the information that exists on the gun, and in fact its existence wouldn't even become somewhat common knowledge until the 1960s. Tragically, not only is most of the documentation for this weapon gone, it seems the prototype, or prototypes themselves, have also vanished or have been scrapped. Now, yes, I want to state that I'm covering something that has been covered by a much better YouTuber than I. If you wish to go watch someone who actually knows how to make videos proper, I recommend you go check out Zwolada's channel right now. Anyways, if you couldn't tell, the T-24 is pretty much just an MG42. However, unlike its brother from the fatherland, this weapon was chambered in 30-06 Springfield. Work on this oddity began in 1943 and was intended to create a more flexible replacement for the M1918 and M1919. In order to create this weapon, the Saginaw Steering Gear Division of General Motors was tasked with converting 2 MG42s to 30-06, as well as reducing the cyclic rate to U.S. Army specification, which was around 600 rounds per minute. It's worth pointing out that these weapons would also later receive new rear sights and bipods taken directly from the Browning automatic rifle, as well as added support for the M2 tripod. Not that it's worth pointing out, but Saginaw had never done any form of weapons development work prior to this, and had only been involved in producing guns designed by other companies. By January 1944, the first trials were conducted, and to say things went poorly would be putting it lightly. On the very first shot with gun number 1, the weapon jammed. This jam was cleared, and then followed by another jam, at which point the weapon was deemed inoperable as everyone had gotten incredibly frustrated with it and concluded the testing with that weapon. The second prototype was actually somehow worse, as it worked just enough to torment its operators with no less than 17 failures to eject in around 3 hours of testing, which was followed up by a brief period of success, which then suffered 2 failures to feed before finally letting out 1 more successful burst. It's worth pointing out that during the firing trials on February 9th, 1944, the 10th round of one particular burst caused a white puff of smoke to shoot out from the receiver, which led to an inspection which showed that the rear half of one bullet's case had ruptured in the chamber after being hit by the firing pin. The more concerning thing was that a second round was discovered in the receiver, which had ruptured without help from the firing pin, and had left its projectile projectile right at the origin of the rifling in the bore. It was noted that the neck and seating shoulder of the second case had severely expanded, which indicated that the first round had ruptured cleanly, while the second round tried to chamber and wasn't able to go in on the way, and was set off by, and I quote, some object. A decent amount of testing was conducted between January and February, but all of this would be marred by the same old phrases: failed to eject, failure to feed, and ruptured case. 51 malfunctions had occurred during this short testing span, and to say everyone was a bit displeased by the end would be putting it lightly. Even the things that couldn't go wrong somehow went wrong, such as the BAR rear sight being mounted far too low on the belt cover to allow for any good line of sight for the gunner. It was later found out that the weapon had suffered so much trouble when firing, due mainly to the difference in length of the American 30-06 compared to the 8mm Mauser. Needless to say, nobody was interested in the T-24 anymore by the time this issue was discovered, and the project was cancelled with, sadly, or happily, depending on how you look at it, neither of the two guns surviving today. The M1E5 Garand, erroneously known as the Tanker Garand story, began back in January of 1944, when an entry into the monthly report of progress on R&D projects from Springfield Armory stated that a shortened Garand rifle had been fabricated by the 93rd Infantry Division and was tested by the Infantry Board. This modification likely came about as the M1 carbine, while a great weapon, was not really designed as a frontline rifle and was more intended as a personal defense weapon, so it was thought that a smaller M1 Garand could provide adequate firepower while still providing all the weight and space-saving benefits of the M1 carbine. The testing had shown that despite the shortened barrel, accuracy had surprisingly not been impaired, and as a result, Chief of Ordnance Colonel Rene Studler directed the Springfield Armory to create a carbine version of the M1 Garand for service issue. Springfield simply proceeded to cut down the barrel from 24 inches to 18 inches and installed a folding pantograph-style stock with a total weight of 8.4 pounds, which was still heavier than the M1 carbine, but weighed a full 1.2 pounds less than the standard M1 Garand. Within only a couple of months, a prototype was submitted for testing, which initially did not feature a pistol grip. However, this would be introduced later on. Much like the 93rd Infantry Division's experimental rifle, accuracy was not greatly affected by the shortened barrel. However, there were three other things that had been carried over quietly. The weapon suffered from horrendously increased recoil, which was, needless to say, not pleasant to experience with a solid metal stock. The other issue had been carried over quietly, but was anything but a quiet problem. By shortening the barrel, you have effectively taken the M1 Garand and turned it into a Loudon boomer. There was also the fact that the muzzle flash had increased greatly as well, which we will talk about later. Following the testing at Aberdeen, it was determined revisions to the stock were needed, as well as the introduction of a muzzle brake to help mitigate the recoil. However, these alterations were never carried out, as Springfield Armory directed their focus to the T20 rifle and ultimately abandoned the M1E5 Garand in late 1944. This would actually turn out to be for the better, as in late 1944, the Pacific War Board pressed the Army Ordnance Unit of the 6th Army in the Philippines to fabricate 150 M1 Garands with shortened barrels. These weapons were field tested in October 1944 on Noam 4 Island, New Guinea, with the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment combat team. The results from these tests were less than stellar, as despite the men liking the idea of a shortened M1 Garand, the muzzle flash was described as being truly apocalyptic, especially in the dark jungle. In fact, it was officially likened to that of a camera flash bulb lighting up. The test report concluded that these shortened M1s were, and I quote, totally unsuitable for a combat weapon. Now, in regards to the M1E5 itself, only one prototype was ever completed, and today this sole prototype resides in the Springfield Armory National Historic Site Museum in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, a weapon like the Browning M2 needs no introduction. It is the longest-running infantry weapon in the United States Army, after all. However, In the late 30s, there was a rather obscure and bizarre modification of this famous beast. This modification would seemingly only be referred to as the Browning M2 anti-mechanization weapon, and was in essence a Ma-Deuce turned into an anti-tank rifle. The first prototype, which was tested in 1936, was basically an early production M2, which used a T3 prismatic optical sight and was fitted to a spring-loaded mount to help dampen the recoil, with the mount itself also being fitted with a shoulder brace, pistol grip, and a bipod. It's worth pointing out that that fancy little T3 prismatic optical sight was a pretty horrible idea on this weapon, as when the gun would fire, the entire weapon would shift backwards in the mount, which could result in the user getting an eye full of optical sight. Now, not a whole lot is known, unfortunately, but this first attempt was almost immediately abandoned, and a new weapon was designed which got rid of the soft mount and would see the bipod and shoulder pad directly incorporated onto the weapon, with later versions being fitted with longer barrels, likely in an attempt to dampen the immense recoil. It's unknown how ammunition would be fed, but it seems likely the weapon would have simply used a shortened standard belt of ammunition, as the need for any more ammo was far less thanks to these weapons being exclusively semi-automatic. This project would ultimately be rejected, though, shortly before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, with the main reason being the carried weight of these weapons was even more than that of the standard Browning M2. The standard Browning M2 was technically 20 pounds heavier than the M2 anti-mechanization weapon. However, it could be broken down into 3 manageable pieces: action, barrel, and tripod. The M2 anti-mechanization weapon, on the other hand, could only be broken down into 2 pieces: action and barrel, as the bipod was permanently attached to the weapon. On these final versions, it was noted that the heavier components of this weapon weighed a spine-snapping 77 pounds. The M2 anti-mechanization weapon also suffered from a serious defect with the use of the bipod, which greatly hampered the ability to traverse the weapon in confined spaces compared to the standard M2's tripod mount. Unfortunately, it seems that there are no surviving examples of these bizarre M2 anti-tank rifles. However, in spirit, the weapon does somewhat live on, as it was basically a precursor to the modern anti-material rifle. I hate gun videos. There's so much conflicting information between sources. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't really know what to say here other than thank you for, yet again, watching my stuff. I also want to say that I have opened up channel membership on my YouTube here. It's $1 a month for early access to videos, which I'm not pressuring any of y'all to do it, because why would you? But my goal is to eventually make enough money from the memberships that I can cut off ads on my videos again. Anyway, it's up to y'all. Any support would be appreciated, even if it is just moral support. And, yeah, I don't really know what to say here. I'm just rambling. So, bye, I guess?